Thank you, worship team. Good morning, everyone. It is nice to be back here in Fenelon. And this morning, we are ending up and wrapping up this series that we've called Broken Gavels on the book of Judges. Not sure if I'm thrilled to be doing this final message in this series. We've probably heard the old expression, you're saving the best for last. I don't think the author of Judges got that memo, just as a warning. All right, I do just want to give a disclaimer that some of this subject matter may contain some subject matter that is not suitable for all ages. Actually, I'm not sure if it's suitable for any age, so I do just want to give warning up front. But we are looking at these final 3 chapters of the book of Judges this morning. But before we do that, I do just want to maybe just share a little story of something that I have been reminded of as I was thinking of this, these final chapters, specifically of a very disturbing movie that I remember watching when I was a young man, probably about 17, 18 years of age. So back when I was just finishing up high school, myself and probably about 5 other guys, we all got hired. We all had church backgrounds, come from different churches, but we worked at a trucking company. And we would work, one of the shifts that we had to work every week was to unload trucks was from 6 to 11 o'clock. And because when you're 18 years old, 11 o'clock still seems early, that when you finish shift, you're still looking for something to do. So we would often, go out for wings, or most often we would go to the Jumbo Video, grab a pizza, and then go back to somebody's house. Do you remember Jumbo Video? Anybody remember those wonderful video places where you actually watch VHS cassette tapes? And kids, you might remember those. You'll learn those about that in history class. But we would go and we would go back and then we would watch this movie and then sort of mosey on home around 2 or 3 in the morning. And anyway, at this one particular time, we all go there, we all go to the video store, we rent this movie, and then we sit there, and I'm not going to say what the movie was, but let me just say it was very dark, it was extremely disturbing, and the content was all around serial killers. And we all sat there just like zombies watching this movie, and then once it's done, we're all sort of quiet, and then make our way back home. And I remember, in the days that followed watching this movie, it had an impact. Like, I was just wrestling with it. It just sat so heavy on my brain. But what was sitting and hitting me most often was not just that the content within the movie itself, was the actual premise of the movie. And in fact, what I was thinking about was like, what is wrong with our world, right? What kind of person would come up with this particular storyline? And I thought, what kind of, people would think this is a great way that we could make money and we would invest in this type of thing? And what kind of actors would actually want to, give their talents to act in something this dark, this degrading? And as I was thinking this over and over for a couple of days, all of a sudden it hit me, and I'm like, Jeff, you numbskull. You actually went to the video store with friends, church friends, you put your $5, $6 to rent this thing, and you sat there and did nothing. Right? You're just as much culpable and complicit as the people who produced it. Right? They wouldn't be making it if there weren't some stupid people who were willing enough to be the audience for it. And this thing that I thought was so bad, this is saying how bad has our culture been, ended up becoming almost an indictment of myself. And I couldn't help but think of that specifically as it relates to the last chapters of the book of Judges. Because what we're going to read in chapter 19, we're going to hear a horrific story. Anybody who looks and sees the events of this story goes, man, that is messed up. That should never, ever happen. And obviously the people see it, they hear it, they respond and go, yes, this is wrong, this is evil. But in their response to it, the response is almost more wicked, more evil than the actual initial event. And the scary thing is that they're completely oblivious to their own wickedness and their own evil. So let's get into it, but maybe just really, really quick, because it is our final week, just do a very, very simple, very quick 1-minute book review of the book of Judges. So if you remember, the book of Judges is the majority of the book deals around these judges or these deliverers who come and specifically rescue the Israelite people from outside invading nations and forces. Also, throughout the book, there is this cycle of sin, the cycle of destruction and dysfunction. Pastor Dave has always been introducing it with the 4 R's, so there's usually this time of peace and tranquility. We'll call it sort of this time of restoration, but as people get kind of, happy with things being good for a time being, it leads the Israelites to rebellion, and specifically the rebellion in which they're most guilty of is this rebellion of idolatry, accepting the Canaanite gods and the impact that they have. Then again, after this time of rebellion, God sends outside nations to oppress them. And then after a while, they can only take so much, and they call out for God to help them. And so there's this time of repentance in which God will raise up these deliverers, these judges who rescue them back to a time of peace. So this cycle continues again and again. But as we get to the end of the book of Judges, once we get past Samson, we've come to the end of these times of Judges, and we also get a look at this rebellion, what it looked like, what this idolatry looked like. And there's no longer any outside nations coming in to oppress, but we're seeing that they've turned on one another, right? Today we're going to see that it actually ends in civil war, right? That the enemy isn't just these bad people out there, but the greatest enemy, the greatest evil is actually within. It's within ourselves. Last week we looked at chapters 17 and 18, and that story just started how something small some small bit of corruption can lead into a greater amount of corruption. So it starts out with this family, this gentleman by the name of Micah, and again, he steals from his mom. He builds this pagan shrine right in his home, but then we meet a corrupt priest, Levitical priest, and then this corruption spreads to a whole tribe, this tribe of Dan. This week, again, we're going to begin with this corrupt priest. We're going to see another corrupt tribe, which is going to be the tribe of Benjamin, but then ultimately, we're going to see the corruption of the entire nation. So let's jump into Judges 19. And for each of these 3 chapters, we're going to look at them, we're going to kind of move through them quickly, but they also have similarities to events either in previous scripture or other portions from the book of Judges. And so for chapter 19, I'm going to call chapter 19 Sodom Revisited, right? If there is any 2 cities that still stand in infamy today as evil and wickedness, we think of Sodom and Gomorrah. You might think of someplace like Las Vegas as the modern day Sodom and Gomorrah, right? What happens is Vegas stays at Vegas, right? It's this picture of debauchery, right? That's sort of the infamy, the reputation that Sodom, the city of Sodom that God had brought on Sodom, Gomorrah, and the other cities of the plain back in Genesis 19. But the very last events that we read about in the Genesis account that happened in this kind of ancient pagan Canaanite city are now being replayed right in one of the cities of Israel. And again, that you're going to see the people are going to respond, well, how could this thing happen? So verse 19 begins this way: in those days, Israel had no king. And this is sort of this refrain that gets repeated. It's going to end the book, and it begins this final section. And that's not all that it says. There's a second part that's going to be implied, but we don't have it here. It's just hinting at it. And everybody did what was right in their own eyes. But it's this idea, it's not that there just wasn't some king sitting upon this throne. In those days, one of the things that was supposed to mark Israel different from all the other Canaanite neighbors was that Yahweh was to be their king. So they hadn't even made their God their king. And here's what's a problem. When there is no authority, when there is no righteous king, people are going to take that authority for themselves. They're going to decide what is good and what is right within their own eyes. So as this story begins and we get that refrain that there was no king, you can understand that what's going to happen is not going to be pretty. So then it starts off this way. Now a Levite who lived in a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim took a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. That would be like a secondary wife. But she was unfaithful, and that's probably not a great translation to him, and she left him and went back to her father's house in Bethlehem in Judah. Now, just a couple things. There's often links between each story in the book of Judges, and so the last section, the last stories, we have a Levite, so that's a priest, an Israelite priest who is coming from Bethlehem and heading up to the hill country of Ephraim. Here we have a priest, a Levite, who's starting out in Ephraim, and he's heading back to Bethlehem. Probably not the same priest. But I want to point out a really, really important detail. Right? Up until now, the book of Judges is so concerned about the idolatry of the people. But there is one extremely important question that as you're going through this book that you should be asking. It's as though there is something missing all the way through. And that's this. Where's the tabernacle? Where is actually the legitimate, the prescribed place of worship where God was to meet with his people and his people were to meet with him? Right? Because it's completely absent up to this point. Now, at the end of the last story, at the final verse of 31, we actually get a clue. And it just says this, and remember, he says, all this time the house of God was in Shiloh. And I want you to say that last bit, all that time the tribe of Dan, or this shrine that is made in Micah's house, and I think you see a little map there, this little region is the hill country. Shiloh is actually, the place of God is in the same place where that pagan shrine was. Now, what's also unique is we are told that this priest, and this is where the Levites are supposed to either work at the tabernacle or at these specific cities that are spread throughout the 12 tribes, we're told that he comes from a remote place in the land of Shiloh. Now, jump ahead to verse 18. We hear another curious detail. He's making his way back, and he describes where he's coming from. Verse 18, it says this, we are on our way from Bethlehem to Judah to a remote area in the hill country of Ephraim where I live. I have been to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of the Lord. And you're going to see in these last couple chapters, the tabernacle is still there, it's still operational, it's still in Shiloh, but it's almost considered remote, that it's almost been abandoned. It's almost been completely forgotten. This is the state of things in Israel at this time. Now let's go back to the story. Not that we want to go back to this story, but so this concubine leaves this priest, and after about 4 months, he decides, I'm going to go back to her home, and I'm going to kind of woo her back. And he actually says, I'm going to speak tenderly to this concubine of mine. And doesn't that sound very romantic? And he shows up at the door, and then as he gets there, it's almost that he completely ignores this wife, and he spends his time all with his father-in-law, and they basically spend 5 days in drinking and feasting and partying, and it seems to be going up and over and above what would be expected, but a time of almost incredible indulgence between this man and his father-in-law. Finally, partway through day 5, he decides, you know what, I got to get back on the road. I got to put the brandy and cigars down, and we got to make our way back home. The father-in-law tries to talk him out of it and says, it's too late, go tomorrow. He's been doing this over and over again, but he says, no, it's time to go. So when they go, what seems to be a reasonable place to spot is this city by the name of Jebus. Jebus would later become the city of Jerusalem, but here at this time it is still a pagan city. This priest's servant says, hey, let's stop here. He says, no, why would I stop at this pagan Canaanite city? We're just a little bit farther away from the city of Gibeah, one of our own tribes people, the tribe of Benjamin. Let's go there, right? So verse 12 says this, his master replied, no, we won't go into an alien city whose people are not Israelites. We will go on to Gibeah. What could go wrong? Obviously. Now, just again, in last week's story, you have this Levite, he's coming from this area. He heads into the tribal area of Ephraim, and the people like Micah sees this as this is a great opportunity. We get to entertain and host an actual priest. What a blessing for us. It's the opposite. Now this priest is going into the tribal area of Benjamin, and he goes to the place in which you would expect when you need some hospitality is to the city gate, but no one offers him hospitality, right? He's a priest. He's a man of stature, but again, he's completely rejected. This older man comes in and from not a Benjamite, but he's actually also from a tribesman from the tribe of Ephraim, and he says, well, why don't you stay with me? And this is where things turn really ugly. This is where things turn really dark. This is where we get the revisit of Sodom. There is a banging at the door. And we're told that these worthless men from the city demand that this man give out his guest. Throw him out there, and let's just say they want him because they want to do unwholesome activities with him throughout the night. Okay? Again, this is not for the faint of heart. This man says, no, he's under my protection. I can't do this. Why would you do this vile thing? But then he comes up with a better idea. Why don't I give you my daughter and his concubine instead? Wonderful. Or isn't this, wouldn't you love to live in this day and age? But as this is all going on, this priest takes things in his own hand and he throws out his own concubine to these wolves and savages through the night. And again, we can only imagine what takes place. And then the next morning, what might be even darker and just as deranged is the response of this priest. Verse 27, he said, when her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, get up, let's go. I guess that's his idea of speaking tenderly, isn't it? It's such a romantic. But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. And then if that's not disturbing enough, he demands a response. And this is what he does. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine limb by limb into 12 parts and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came out of Egypt. Think about it, consider it, tell us what to do. Right? We've got the reenactment of Sodom, and it's taking place right now in Israel, in one of their own tribes, in one of their own cities. How are we to respond, right? This epitome of evilness is now taking place amongst the people. This leads us to chapter 20, and I'm calling this Abimelech Revisited. Could have used almost any of these judges, but if you remember, once we have this introduction of Gideon, there's this new theme that comes out in the book of Judges, this theme of revenge. That so much of the action, so much of the violence that takes place is a response to some sort of personal attack. Right? It's based on a personal vendetta. So remember Gideon, he goes out and he defeats the Midianites, but he goes to 2 cities, he asks them for help, for food, and they said, no, you're kind of doing overkill. And then what he does is he goes back and he attacks and humiliates those 2 cities. Right? Or you think about Jephthah beats the Ammonites, and then after he defeats the Ammonites, the Ephraimites come to him, and they have a problem with the way he did it. So what does he do? He almost goes and he attacks the Ephraimites and kills thousands of fellow tribesmen. If you think of the story of Samson acts incredibly against the Philistines, but every time he acts, it's based on a personal vendetta. Right? Never because God has called him, never because he wants to do it for any moral reason, but because he has been personally insulted. But it was Abimelech, right? When that city of Shechem turned on him, that named him king, when they disrespected it, he went back and he annihilated them top to bottom, women and child, and everybody, made sure not there was one survivor. And then as soon as he did that, he did the same thing to another city. Fortunately, a woman was able to drop a stone on his head to end the violence, right? And so what we're going to see is there's not just violence, but it is done to an almost incredible extent, okay? So we're talking about rash responses. So after all these tribes receive their wonderful, lovely packages in the mail, they all decide to come, and they meet at this place called Mizpah to figure out what they're going to do with this fallen tribe, with these people. And they have the priest there, and they ask him to tell the story. Now, I want you to listen to the way in verse 4 this priest retells the story. Again, he gives the details, but he does it in a way that basically removes any complicity of himself. So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, I and my concubine came to Gibeah in Benjamin to spend the night. During the night, the men, and actually the word there is the leader of Gibeah, and that word isn't actually the right word. The word original was these worthless men, but he blames it on the actual leaders of the town, came after me, surrounded the house, and intended to kill me. We're not sure if that was the intent. They intended to do something, but we're not sure it's murder. And then he just says, they raped my concubine and she died. He forgets to mention that he was the one who handed her to the wolves, okay? So I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and we don't know if she was still alive when she came back. So if she was alive, there's a very possibility he was the one who murdered her. Cut her into pieces, sent one to each of the Israel's inheritance because they committed this lewd and disgraceful act in Israel. Now all you Israelites, speak up and give your verdict. Right, this guy wants revenge, but he doesn't have strength as Samson, so he can't carry it out himself. So he's asking the whole nation to come and avenge him for him. Again, there should be some sort of trial, but they all agree it's time for us to take up arms, and each tribe needs to give some men so that we can attack the tribe of Benjamin. First, they say to Benjamin, give us these men who are guilty. They say no, and the Benjamites arm themselves for battle. But before they go to battle, they want to inquire if God is in this. And so they come to this place of Mizpah, and you're wondering, well, why if they're inquiring of the Lord are they in Mizpah and not Shiloh, where the high priest is supposed to be and where the tabernacle is supposed to be? And they just ask, who will go up and fight for us? And it's funny, at the very beginning of the book, as the people are going in and taking over the tribes, one of the very first lines that we read in chapter 1 is, who will go up to us? And God says, Judah will go up, and Judah goes up and has victory. Here God responds, and it says in verse 18 that it will be Judah who goes up. But then in verse 21, we realize the Benjamites wall up Israel, and 22,000 die. And it's not just 22,000 people from the tribe of Judah died. It says the men of Israel lost 22,000 people. It's as though they didn't even obey the word here. So then they go back to Mizpah. They start weeping, and they ask of God, inquire of God again, shall we go up again to battle with Benjamin, our brother? And you think that almost answers the question. Should we attack and fight our brother? Right? Remember the beginning, Genesis chapter 4. Am I my brother's keeper? And the answer is yes, you absolutely are your brother's keeper. Cain, you don't murder your brother. And God responds, go up against them. They get walloped again, and 18,000 lives are lost. Then it says, then the Israelites, verse 26, and all the people went up to Bethel. And there they sat weeping before the Lord. They fasted that day until evening and presented burnt offerings and fellowship offerings to the Lord. And listen to this. And the Israelites inquired of the Lord. In those days, the ark of the covenant of God was there with Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, ministering before it. They asked, shall we go up again into battle with Benjamin, our brother, or not? So they noticed they went to Bethel. And the high priest is in Bethel, not in Shiloh. And he's ministering there. So you're kind of going, well, where were they going to minister of God before this? And there's another unique thing. One of the things that we think when we're going through this book of Judges is this downward spiral, that it just keeps getting worse, that it's this kind of slow, gradual frog in the pot. You know, the evil kind of just builds up over the time. What is actually really, really astounding and scary about the book of Judges, when you get to the end, both the stories of last week with this tribe of Dan and this fallen priest, and that priest was the grandson of Moses. This is the grandson of Moses' brother, Aaron. We actually realize this is very, very early on in the Judges period. It wasn't a downward spiral. It almost went and started off really, really bad. And in fact, in Judges 2:10, it says that generation after the generation of Joshua was the judge that forgot them. Right? One of the things that we even think in our own world is that would never happen in our time. Right? Think of even all the travesties that just happened throughout human history, but even in the last century alone, whether it be the Holocaust in Germany or the forced famine, the Armenian genocide or the Holodomor in Ukraine under the Bolsheviks, right? I guarantee every generation said it would never happen in our time, and then they're completely caught off guard when they see how bad it gets and how quick it can get so quickly. But here God responds, says, "Go, for tomorrow I will give them into your hands." And this is where they go into Abimelech. As you're going to find out, they don't just go out and wipe out these gentlemen or wipe out the soldiers. They go in and they desecrate and destroy just about every living Benjamin left. In fact, I won't go through the details, but basically what happens, they go out and they break out the army into 3 different units. So they have this first one that goes out to face them. They're fighting against the Benjamins. The Benjamites are starting to win. It looks pretty good. But as they're fighting, they send another contingent into the city of Gibeah and they put it to fire and to put it to the sword. They start to, attacking the women and children. Right? So as they realize what's going on, they kind of turn back saying, we got to rescue them. All of a sudden, another ambush comes out and they don't have a chance. And they have, the tribe of Benjamin has to flee to get away. And meanwhile, so half the army goes to attack and to kill the men of war. The other half goes back and then they just destroy all the other towns of the tribe of Benjamin. And it literally says killing women, child, and even all the animals. They put them to wholesale slaughter. Finally, all that is left at the end of chapter 20 is 600 Benjamite men. The whole tribe has been desecrated. They get to this rock. They're kind of begging for mercy. And all of a sudden, it dawns on them and says, maybe it is not a good idea to completely wipe out one of our own family members. Maybe that's a bad idea. And so they stopped themselves just short with only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin left, and they realized we got to rebuild this tribe. How can we do that? And this leads to chapter 21 where it ends, and I'm calling this Jephthah Revisited, and it's all based around rash vows. Do you remember the story of Jephthah? He's this judge, and he's been chosen to lead the Israelites to face the Ammonites. But before he's about to go into battle, he goes to God and says, God, if you give me victory, I promise you when I return home, the first thing that comes out of my door, I'm going to sacrifice to you as a burnt offering. And tragically, his daughter comes the first thing that comes out of his door. And tragically, he actually offers up his daughter as a burnt offering. Again, it's a terrible, terrible thing. And you'll notice in this last chapter, there's a whole bunch of terrible vows that the people make, and they're trying to get around it. However, if they actually knew the will of the God they served, they would know that the Lord had given them an escape clause. That, sometimes it's actually more wicked to carry out the vow, even if it was done in God's name. And in fact, even making the vow is the greater sin of all. So for example, just if they knew what God had said in Leviticus chapter 5, verses 4 to 6, listen to this. It says this, if a person thoughtlessly takes an oath to do anything, whether good or evil in any matter one might carelessly swear about, even though he is unaware of it, in any case, when he learns of it, he will be guilty. Basically, the Bible says, their own law says, if you make a stupid vow, an evil vow, that is actually a greater sin than carrying it out itself. And you need to repent of the sin of bad vows, bad oaths. And then it says this, when anyone is guilty of in any of these ways, he must confess it in what way he has sinned, and in a penalty for that sin he has committed, he must bring to the Lord a female lamb or goat from the flock as a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him and for his sin. Right? If you make a bad vow, here's actually a very insignificant offering that you can do, and it devalidates it. They haven't quite clued into that. In fact, they feel like they still have to follow in these vows. So what are these vows that they make? Listen to verse 21, how it starts. Then the men of Israel had taken an oath at Mizpah, not one of us will give his daughter in marriage to a Benjamite. Okay, so we got 600 men, they all need wives, but none of us, we've made a vow, we can't be any of our daughters, so what are we going to do? So it says this, verse 2, it says, the people went to Bethel where they sat before God until evening, raising their voices and weeping bitterly. O Lord, the God of Israel, they cried, why has this happened to Israel? Why should one tribe be missing from Israel today? I can't understand why. Maybe because you killed everybody. Maybe this isn't God's problem, maybe this is your problem. All right? Then they ask God, what shall we do? But they don't want to wait till God gives them an answer. Listen to what they come up to. This is absolutely brilliant. Then the Israelites asked, who from all the tribes of Israel had failed to assemble before the Lord? And we're told that they made another dumb vow. It says this, for they had taken a solemn oath that anyone who failed to assemble before the Lord at Mizpah should certainly be put to death. And then they discover, we read on a little bit further on, verse 8, they discovered that no one from Jabesh Gilead had come to the camp for the assembly. For when they counted the people, they found that none of the people of Jabesh Gilead were there. And so this is the plan they came up with, verse 10. So they assembled 12,000 fighting men with instructions to go to Jabesh Gilead and put the sword to those living there, including the women and children. This is what you are to do, they said, kill every male and every woman who is not a virgin. They found among the people living in Jabesh Gilead 400 young women who had never slept with a man, and they took them to camp at Shiloh in Canaan. Oh, now the tabernacle shows up again. After they've slaughtered more people, stolen wives. Isn't this brilliant? What a great, brilliant tactic. And let's bring them the tabernacle because maybe God will be pleased with this. Maybe we can get God's stamp of approval on this. But you notice there's still a mathematical problem. That gives them 400 wives, but the need is 600, so they need 200 wives. But then we learn one other verse, one other dumb vow, but maybe it's the same vow as the first one, but there's another twist on it. Verse 18, it says this, well, we still need to find 200 daughters as wives. Verse 6, as we Israelites have taken this oath, cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjaminite. Right? So not only are we pledged not to do it, but we actually pronounced a curse on anyone who would give their own kids as a wife. So here's their next brilliant plan, verse 19. But look, there's this annual festival at of the Lord in Shiloh, to the north of Bethel, to the east of the road that goes down to Bethel, to Shechem, and to the south of Lebanon. It's kind of funny because, again, here's the place of the tabernacle, and they have to give instructions. It's the place where they're supposed to go about 3 or 4 times a year, everyone, and they have to give directions. Right? It's very remote at this time. And this is what they came up with, verse 20. So they instructed the Benjamites, say, go and hide in the vineyards and watch. When the girls of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, then rush from the vineyards, each of you, and seize a wife from the girls of Shiloh, and go to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, do us a kindness by helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war, and you are innocent since you did not give your daughters to them. Right? So we're not giving to them, but if you steal them and it's against your will, then hey, that covers it, right? Brilliant idea, right? These guys are just moral giants. And then they carry out this plan, and that's the end of the book of Judges, right? Don't we all just love happy endings? Especially like these romantic happy endings, you know, you get these 600 bachelors and they meet these wonderful, you know, bachelorettes, and it's just this happy ending ever after. Like, if this doesn't make a Hallmark story, perfect movie, I don't know what does, right? And then we have that final conclusion of this book. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Well, that's the book of Judges. Let's pray. We need it. Right? Like, what do you do with that? Right? Like, it's pretty messed up. You know, what's the application? Okay, folks, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get this. Don't go home. Even if you don't like your aunts and uncles and your brothers and sisters, even if it's a little bit estranged, don't go out and slaughter them. And if you feel bad afterwards, don't, steal, other people's daughters and give it to them. That's the practical application. Hopefully we don't need messages to preach that. But why on earth do we have this book of Judges? Right? It's dark. It's depressing. The book of Judges is primarily given as a warning. It's showing us the signs that led to the darkest days in a nation. And it's God saying, I do not wish this on anybody. Nobody should have this. And one of the biggest mistakes that we can make when we're going through this book, and I actually think this is a very, very important book for our current day and age. But one of the biggest mistakes is that we can do is going and reading these stories and reading these books is going, oh, man, they were messed up back then. Right? I am so glad I didn't live in those days. They were barbarians. They were savage. That was awful. No. The book of the Judges is given to us so we won't make the mistakes. Same mistakes. But it's also for us to say, why don't you take account and look at your own life, your own world, your own culture? Are there things, is there wickedness, is there evil in your own world that you are just as oblivious to as the people in ancient Israel were oblivious to? Just pick on something that I think really hits close to home. Think about chapter 19. Where does it all start? A sexual assault. Where does it end? Sexual assault of not just one, but 600 young women, right? And mass devastation. How is our world looking today and just in that whole area of sexuality and culture? Right? It's pretty bad. Right? Let's just think about this for a second. Is there anything we glorify more than sexuality in our world today? Hard to think of anything more. We have a massive fatherless epidemic in our world. And again, a lot of that is done because of husbands and men abandoning the responsibility of their wives, their girlfriends, and ultimately their children, often because of sexual dalliances. We have massive addictions to pornography, multi-billion-dollar industry. We're seeing a massive rise in the sex trade industry and sex slavery. Even with young women especially, we're seeing massive rises in cosmetic surgery and all sorts of different things, and depression, because nobody feels that they can live up to the ideal, glamorous, airbrushed sexual images that are in front of people 24/7 whenever they pass a magazine stand or turn on their television. We've even gone so crazy is that we're telling people if you're upset that maybe you were born in the wrong body. Right? We have a social contagion. And the best way to deal with it is just a lifetime of drugs and surgeries. And if anybody says challenges at a question, they'll call you every bad name under the book and maybe even threaten to take your own kids away from you. Our world is broken. Our world is broken. And why do we justify it all today? It's the same reason they justified it back then. Right? Because there was no king. Right? Our world hates authority. Right? Right? We don't even use the word authority, right? Everybody's afraid of being called a fascist. And so why do we justify everything? Because it all seems right in our own eyes. Right? We still live by that same mentality. We want to decide what is right and what's wrong. But there's this other element on it, and again, it's very easy to turn around and say, yeah, the world is going to hell in a handbasket. That's easy to see, and we can point all these different things out. But it was very, very obvious that the people of Israel, this priest, they see what happens to this concubine and say, this is wrong, this is terribly evil, this should never happen in our day. But then are completely oblivious to the own evil that they carry out and perpetuate. It's terrifying. And so not only are we just to say, oh yeah, the world is really bad, it's really, really fallen. Ultimately, we are also to say, what about our own lives? What about in our own homes? What about in our own families? Have we become just as oblivious? Right? It's easy to say, I can't believe I live in a world who would make that kind of garbage for a movie screen. But I have to ask the question, then why am I showing it on my TV? Right? We have to make it personal. But I love even just how we started this service today. I think Glenda said, my father said he can never end the service. And every sermon that doesn't include the gospel is a missed opportunity. And as terrible as the book of Judges is, and as terrible as it ends, it actually ends with a glimmer and a picture of hope. Right? It says, in those days there was no king. But the reason that line is there, because it lays the seed, it lays the promise that one day there will be a king. And one day a king will come who will not be like the other judges that we meet in this book, who just save us from these outside enemies. But the king who will come and save us from our worst enemy of all, the enemy of our own selfishness, the enemy of our own debauchery, the enemy of our own sin. And here's the amazing thing about this book of Judges. Everything about it points us to that king, the necessity of that king, and the reason why we're here today is we proclaim that the king has actually come, and his king has a name, and his name is Jesus Christ. And he has paid that penalty. He has rescued that from that sin. And he is the one that we need more than anything else. And we worship and praise that king 52 weeks a year, but we can't wait to praise that king in 2 weeks because we celebrate what he did at Calvary when he came and he rescued us from the damage of sin, from the evil within. That's the king we need. That's the king they needed in the time of Judges. And that is actually still the king we still need today, both in our own lives, but we also need to be taking out to the world and telling people that he is there, he is available, and he provides rescue. And I'm going to ask the worship team to come and close the service in song.